So, jetzt. Hello and welcome to our live development stream for October 2021. We are back from our pause and did work a little bit more on the Spline Morph deformation. Actually, not just a bit more, but finished it. And have also started on the plugin of the month for this month, which is the second camera master plugin. And yeah, I'm going to cover both of those. So let's start with the Spline Morph deformer, and I'm going to just use the sample scene that I created for it. And what we basically have here is we have a colored cube, and I have the, there we go, I've got the db&w Spline Morph deformer applied to it. And the cube itself has 4 different morph maps. One is 3 actually. There's the base mesh. Then you have one at 90 degrees, 180 and 270. So I basically took the vertical axis and rotated the cube for the different morph maps. Now, what Spline Morph does is essentially, well, a morph map is nothing but different vertex positions for a mesh. And what Spline Morph does is it looks at a specific vertex, then looks at the other positions in the morph maps, and uses those point positions to create a spline curve, which is in turn used to proceed through all the morphs. And to help visualize that, not just for you, but for me as well, we have the preview option here, which allows you to enter the index of a specific vertex on the mesh. As you can see here, let me just zoom in. There we go. So yeah, you can select which vertex you want to watch, and it basically shows you the spline that's created by going through all the different morph map positions. Also, if you select any of the morph maps, it's going to give you a green circle here, 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 which is the position of that currently selected vertex as defined by that morph map. So let me just see, might be easier if I just go to bounding box actually, or just go to vertices, exactly. Because we all know there's a cube here. So basically, if I select the base, it's going to select this one. At 90 degrees, that vertex is going to be here. At 180, it's going to be here, and at 270, it's going to be here. And I'm using those 4 positions as a closed spline that goes from 0 to 100%. Also, the incoming spline for the first morph map, or the incoming spline segment for the first morph map, and for the third one is linear. So you get like spline, 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 then it's a linear transition, then it's a spline again, a TCB spline, and then another linear transition. And I can just turn these off and this gives me a standard TCB spline for the movement of that single vertex. And that's being applied to all the vertices on the cube. So if I go back to the textured solid, you will see that the whole cube just rotates. Now, if this was a standard morph, the way that Lightwave computes it, then you would essentially get the same as setting everything here to linear, and you would get this kind of movement for the cube. Whereas with the spline, it tends to preserve the volume a little bit better. It's not perfect, but you can still tweak the spline settings. Also, one thing, this was why I initially thought about something like that, would be something like having the morph of a blinking eyelid. And if you just have like an open eyelid and a closed eyelid, and it's going to morph in a linear way, then it's just going to go through the geometry of the eyeball. With this, you can basically have a third morph map that's like in between open and closed. And those three already form a spline that you can use for the transition of the blinking eyelid without it actually going into the eyeball. I don't have an example though. And as you can do with all other splines in Lightwave, you can still, let's take the 180, which is this vertex position here. You can still change the tension, as you can do with normal splines in the graph editor. Increase the tension, decrease the tension, continuity, or change the bias. And actually, I think if I change the tension to -1 on everything, that's a bit too much. -0.5 maybe? Yeah, that looks good. Yeah, at -0.5 we actually seem to have something that is very close to a perfect circle, if it's not just a perfect circle. And this is something you could never do with linear morphing, especially not with 3 morph maps. Yeah, the eye blinking thing is it's a problem I had like 15 years ago, um, but I kind of never stopped thinking about it, and I think this has uses beyond that as well. Okay, so that's the basics. Additional part here is you can also use a weight map, and I've got one here. In my case, the weight map goes from 0% at the top polygon to 0 from 100% at the top to 0% at the bottom. So in this case, it means that just the top is being rotated and the bottom vertices aren't moved at all because their strength is at 0%, which in this case doesn't make sense, but you might have a use case where you want to have a bit more control over what is being morphed and by how much. And one thing you can also do is you can control the master strength of the whole morphing process by using the strength here. And as you can see, ooh, this is not what's supposed to happen. Okay, so it's actually, this is strange. This is really odd. I'll have to look at the strength again. But yeah, so that's the basic idea of the spline morph deformer. And also the preview is only visible if you actually have the item selected. So if I select something else, you see it's not being selected anymore. There's no preview on the item itself. Now it's back, and you can also Just turn the preview on and off here, or just select one of the other vertices. And yeah, that preview was crucial for me just to see if my splines are right. It would be a bit like a twist deformer. Yeah. It could be, yes. I'll update the download scene. It's just I just need to upload the mesh, and then you will get the weight map in there. But in the end, what you can do, just go over to Modeler, create a weight map, and have the top four vertices set to 100%, the bottom four to 0%. It's the same thing. Okay. I do have one or two reports, actually one report of the plugin crashing. So if that happens to you, um, shoot me a mail or write something in Discord with your Windows version and the lightweight version, and maybe steps on how to reproduce it. I'm not quite sure if it's the code itself or if it's the way I inject the patron names afterwards. Ah, that means that it doesn't actually have the plugin installed. Yeah. Then it should work once you have the plugin installed. It depends on where you have it installed. If you install it the way it's on the wiki, then Lightwave will pick up changes automatically. Otherwise, you will have to manually re-add the plugin. It depends on the location and where you store it. I'm lazy, so I'm doing it the way it's in the wiki, which basically means I just need to copy the new plugin over, and if anything has been added to the plugin, then Lightwave picks that up automatically at that location, because it essentially scans the plugin every time it starts, or at least plugins that have changed. It's on our db&w tools wiki. There's an installation part at the top, and I think that's where I mentioned it. Okay, so that's the current state, and yeah, I'll have to look at the weight map and strength again. There's also something else that I wanted to add, and I might do that. One idea was to use the weight map not as an absolute weight in the sense that, you know, it's 0 to whatever, but as a relative weight. So what you could do is, say you have a weight map that goes from 100% to 0%, but that only defines an offset on the progress here that you're animating. So you could do things like use this kind of weight map, or this kind of morph maps and spline morph animation, but use a weight map to offset the timing of every single vertex. So that a vertex at, let's say, 0% will be at the position of the current time. But let's say if a vertex is at 50%, it's actually using a progress along the spline that's a bit further along, whereas a negative value would push it back. And that would allow you to do something like a twist, but with a variable offset in time per vertex defined by a weight map, if that makes any sense. And maybe even have a scale factor for that. So you would say that, okay, looking at the progress percentage value of 100% within the offset weight map would be the equivalent of 15% on that progress. And the offset weight map would be used in relation to the progress itself. So if you say the progress weight map has a amplitude, I suppose, or strength of 15%, then a value of minus 100 on the weight map would basically use the current progress minus 15%, and a value of 100% on the weight map would use the current progress percentage plus another 15%, because 15% is the range of the offset weight map. And if you can animate all of that, you could do all kinds of funky stuff. And I'm sure somebody's going to find a use case for them. Okay, so that's that. I'll just leave this here actually. And the other thing is that this month we only had 2 plugins to choose from, mainly because I couldn't actually think of a third one that would kind of make sense within the time that we have for a monthly plugin, and also one that would be as useful as we'd like it to be, or that would be as polished as we'd like it to be. So I'd rather have 2 good suggestions than, a third one that doesn't make much sense. Having said that, if you guys have any ideas, shout out, comment on our Patreon page, or just send us a message on Discord, or just comment there, because I'm certainly looking for new things to do. All right, so second unit. This is just a user interface mockup, so it's going to be a master plugin, and this one saves and loads with the scene, so it's completely scene specific. The idea here is that it allows you to store certain values per camera. There are some things in Lightwave that are global, like, for example, the background image, the render range, or even the limited range, which, regardless of how many cameras you have, will always be the same. Wheel rotator was a tricky one, very tricky one. And it was a 2-month one as well. I mean, I'm still thinking about future spline tools, but even something that is as seemingly simple as rendering a spline will take more than a month for sure. And it also wouldn't work with Octane. And don't get me started on actually creating geometry in layout, which is a completely different can of worms. All right, so second unit. Many things are stored globally, such as render range, background, limited range, etc. And the idea is that the master plugin allows you to store those per camera. So if you have, let me just add another camera. There we go. Come on. Oh, yeah, if this opens in a second display, let's call this the second camera. And yeah, I've got 2 cameras here. Don't know why this one is animated, but what the heck? Oh, that's why. All right, so I've got 2 cameras here. And let's focus on those. I think I've completely forgotten how to navigate in Lightwave. Almost. All right, never mind. So that's what working in Blender does to you. All right, so we've got 2 cameras, and if we look at something like the render properties, if I change the start end frame to 0 and 60 and switch to the other camera, it's going to be the same, because this is a global setting. However, there's quite a few settings that can actually be read from the SDK and written by the SDK. So what the second unit essentially does, there we what it essentially does is um, whenever a new camera or a different camera is selected, um, prior to the change of or when that happens, it will take let's look just take the render range. It will take the current values of the render range and store them um, internally, and have that store be related to the previous camera that was selected. Muscle memory can fade really, really quickly. I was surprised as well. And I have to say, the numpad navigation in Blender is gorgeous. Off topic though. All right. So when you switch from one camera to the other, it detects the fact that you've selected a new camera and that the old one was different. So it will take the current values if this is active, of the render range and store them internally in relation to the object ID of the previous camera. Then it will check if there is something stored using the object ID of the new camera. And if that is the case, like if a render range has been stored in relation to that new camera ID, then it will restore that. And if there is nothing stored under the new camera, it's just going to use the previous value. Um, what this basically allows you to do is there is going to be a number of options here. Right now it's store background, store render range, store limited range. And this is also something where I need your feedback. So if there's something that is global in Lightwave right now, but you would like to have that per camera, um, shoot us something on Discord. Um, I'm going to make this very modular, so it's going to be easy to add new items here. But still, the more I have in the beginning, the better. It doesn't mean that everything is going to work, but those three are going to work. So basically, if you switch to another camera, it's going to take the current values of, in this case, the background image, the render range, the limited range, and store that for the previous camera. And then if something has been stored for the newly selected camera, it's going to restore those and make them live and global. So you can have multiple cameras and they all have their own local settings. And the way to change those settings is basically just by changing the render range here. And then when you select another camera, then this render range is going to be changed by the plugin automatically. So that's the general idea of second unit. And also one thing that I'm going to add is you are going to be able to set a render camera. So in this pop-up, you will see all the cameras in the scene. And what this does is it makes sure that if you save the scene, then whatever you designate as being the render camera is set to be the current camera. Because one thing that happens if you, for example, send a scene to be rendered on a network using ScreamerNet, is that Lightwave essentially uses the last selected camera as the camera to render from. Now the problem is if you have a scene with multiple, like for example, helper cameras, and you forget to actually select the main camera before you save the scene and send it to your render nodes, you're not going to get the images back that you actually wanted because it's going to render them from the wrong scene. So this set render camera option is supposed to prevent that. So you don't accidentally save something, send it to the farm, and then find out on the next morning that you actually had the wrong camera selected. And I'm not sure if any of you are as bad as I am, but that has certainly happened a lot to me. So yeah, this is something I just need to have in there. So yeah, what's important about this certainly is getting more information from you guys, more suggestions on what else you would like to be able to store per camera. And as I said, for some things it might not be possible. For some things, it certainly could be. For example, I think camera render settings. Just check. Some of these settings, for example, could probably be stored per camera as well. Um, well, it doesn't support presets in that sense. All it does is it takes what's currently used in the main user interface, and once you switch to camera, whatever is stored in the main user interface is stored to be camera specific, and when you switch back to the camera, it's being restored. Um, uh, if I can, yeah, the problem is I don't think it would work with the buffer names. Maybe, I'm not sure what's available in the SDK, but maybe the base save path or something like that. But then again, uses the preferences output path. Um, it could be that I could make these two camera specific, but none of the others really. It depends on what I can actually write back using the SDK. I know that this would work. Um, doesn't make much sense for this. Limited region, yes. Maybe even overlay. Um, the render settings, I'm not sure if I can actually set all of those. I can surely read out most of these, but the plugin also needs to be able to change them. The same goes for global illumination. I think all of these values aren't available through the SDK, at least not easily, if at all. Same goes for volumetrics. Um, maybe some of the buffer settings could be. Yeah, I'll look at those. So samples should be possible. Motion effects, stereo, depth of field should be able to change that per camera. And yeah, for those, I'm not sure. I'll have to check, but I'll have to check with everything. Yeah, preset thing is completely different. Um, that would be a different project, essentially. No, this is just about being able to store things per camera within your scene. Um, not about having actual presets you can save out. That might be, yeah, I'm not sure if that could be added. It might be possible to actually leverage what I'm doing here for either an extension to this or a completely new plugin that is quite similar, but as opposed to store background, store render range, store limited range, it would give you the option to save and load a background render range or limited range, something like that. So similar to this, using some of the same base code, but doing something completely different. So yeah, that's the current state of things. Um, so first thing I'll do is probably add the render camera functionality to this. Then I kind of have an idea of how the data handling back end of all of this is going to work. And once that is done, then I'm certainly looking forward to suggestions on what else could be added. But we did have the render output, camera settings, and maybe render settings. One of the um, kind of downsides of how the Lightwave SDK works in many cases is that you can use the API with your C++ code to read out values. For example, it's quite easy to read out the number of minimum samples or maximum samples, but in most cases for settings like that, you can't actually change them from the SDK. So I know what the minimum samples is, but I can't change it. And all of that actually happens through the commands. And if you go to help, no, it's not help. Or basically, if you go to just the keyboard shortcuts, a lot of what you see here is commands on the left-hand side. But there's also a way to export them. It might be in utilities. Yeah, you have your command history and your command input, and you have the option to save a command list. Let me just quickly do that. If I haven't done that already. No, I haven't. Oh, I did. Okay. Let's just open that as a text file. Come on. All right. So these are all the commands that layout understands. And basically, if I can change a value using these commands, then I can actually add it to the camera switching system as well. And let's see, what do we have here that I can use? For example, enable volumetrics, 0 and 1. That is something that can be stored and restored. Enabling volumetric lights, enabling radiosity, lens flares. All of these are things that could be saved per camera. The same for, I think, the backdrop type, the backdrop color, fog distances if they're actually still being used. What else do we have here? You could probably even have a per camera color space settings, but that doesn't really make sense. Yeah, you have to save RGB prefix. That's what you're using for the output file names. And well, you can actually load and save render settings and presets. Not sure where they actually come from, but yeah. Yeah, you can set whether ray trace reflections, shadows, refractions are on or off. Recursion limits, although I'm not sure if those correspond to the current render settings or are leftovers from the previous render and shading engine. But that actually might be new. Reflection limits. So yeah, all of these can be read out and also set by the plugin. But yeah, that's essentially what I'm going to do is if you have a suggestion on what you would like to see written and restored, I look at the SDK to see if I can read the information. And then I also look into the command list here. And there's a bit better one in the SDK docs itself with comments on what things do. And see if it's possible to actually write back those values. And if both things are possible, then yeah. Well, the thing is about writing out to a camera file, what the camera settings here would do is it probably, I'm not sure if it would be the camera type as well, or maybe the focal length. Many of these things wouldn't be in there. So yeah, I suspect if we actually make another plugin, which is more like a generic presets plugin, then it should be more comprehensive in what it writes and loads compared to this. Second unit is a bit more um, granular, I suppose. So, I mean, one option would be to say, okay, have store camera settings, and that would store all of this. Another option, though, would be to say, okay, let's not store the camera settings, but let's have an option to store the anti-aliasing settings, motion effects, stereo, depth of field separately. So you can say, okay, I actually would like the same depth of field for all of my cameras, but actually, no, wait. These settings are per camera anyways, aren't they? Yeah, they are per camera anyway, so that's kind of stupid. Um, that doesn't make sense at all because yeah, these settings are per camera either way. So this actually doesn't even make sense for second unit, but it might make sense for preset. So yeah, all the camera properties, they're not going to be touched by second unit because they change. They're not global anyways. But something like render settings will. And even then the question is, okay, in this case, all of these settings, if possible, should be stored as one thing, again, if possible. Um, but for example, buffer settings, if they can be changed, should be different from, should be a different toggle here than the render settings or the generic settings like the render range. And I would also have to document quite carefully in the wiki which settings it will actually be able to load and save. Because in some cases it might not be everything. Like for example, if this says store output file name and it only changes two of these settings, but maybe not the buffer name itself, um, then that has to be documented. So don't have any nasty surprises. So yeah, that gives me a bit of a list. And what was the issue? Oh yeah, the strength and the weight map, exactly, yeah. Also, I did have a bug report by somebody who had problems with the Spline editor um, on 2019.1.5. Yeah, that's one way. Just basically save an empty scene file with the camera or whatever you want, and then load from scene. Um, or use that as a template for your project. Absolutely, yeah. Of course, the downside is if you change it and you want to change some other files as well, then yeah, you'll have to do it manually, and that's where something like being able to save and load settings would certainly be very nice. Yeah, I agree. Yes, we did have bug reports about the Spline tool not working on 29.1.5. Um, I thought the last patch that I sent out today would fix it, but apparently it didn't. I can't really reproduce it. But in general, if you guys have any issues, make sure to get in touch with me, report them, and um, if possible, give me information about your operating system, lightweight version, and also the steps that you've been doing. Maybe also how you installed the plugin, and then I'll try to get down to it. And as mentioned earlier, on the release versions, we always, where it says development release here, we have the names of our patrons. If that patching, because that happens after I compile the code, if that continues, if that actually is an issue, then I'll probably just have to drop it completely and just have a more generic thank you there, like we do on the macOS versions anyways, because of the code signing, which is a completely different ballpark. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I've got to talk about today. Yeah, Mikael, thank you. Thanks a ton, because you've sponsored them for quite some time now. So yeah, we're extremely grateful for our uh, only sponsor, but also our best sponsor. All right. So if you don't have any more questions, then I think that would be it. Um, I'm gonna see what I can do about the 2019.1.5 issue, and hopefully be able to send out something new tomorrow. Maybe I'll find what's happening. And no, the hatching shader isn't abandoned, HSP3D. The problem is, and I tried to get to that in the well, we don't have a hatching shader there. That's the what's it called? Halftone shader. Um, the problem is with the new shading engine, the shading itself doesn't actually happen in the nodes. It happens in the integrator. Aha, I've got a user interface here. I can show it to you. Yeah, there we go, F5. All right, so surface editor, and let's go to the node editor. So in versions of Lightwave prior to 2018, when the big shading engine changed, what would happen is what the material would output here would just be the RGB of the final shaded material, just as you would see it in the final render. So you'd have all the inputs that define how the shader is being computed. The shader itself would compute the shading and output the color to the surface output node. This has changed in 2018 for very good reasons. But basically, what the materials do now is they classify a material into different components like diffuse, reflection, refraction. And all of these components get a strength, which is essentially an RGB value. So if you have uh, a diffuse value that is an RGB of what is reddish, what will happen is that later on, Lightwave will compute the diffuse component and multiply it by that reddish weight, which will give you a red diffusion. Um, which is essentially what the what shaders do anyways. It's just a different way to think about it. The difference though is that the shading doesn't happen here in this node anymore. It actually happens back here in the shading model. So this is where the actual trays are being raised. The rays are the trays are being raised. No, this is where the rays are being traced. And even though we could actually raise some trays as well. Yeah, so this is where the actual ray tracing happens. Essentially, it's this piece of code, and that takes the weights that the different materials provide to it, traces the rays if required, for example, for reflections, then multiplies them by the weights and combines them, and then creates a final output color. However, that also means not quite. I meant proper trays. So yeah, what that also means is that if you, for example, want to have some kind of hatching or halftone that is or that hatches or halftones according to a shaded surface, you cannot do it within the nodal tree because nothing has been or is being shaded here. You have to actually basically write a shading model that then uses hatching as well, which is tricky because that part of the SDK isn't that well documented. And also the developers that wrote it aren't available at Newtek anymore. So I can't just bug them on Discord, which I love to do, but yeah. Um, so yeah, that would basically mean writing a new shading model here. And as far as I know, no third party has ever done that. And also isn't a sample shading model in the SDK, which is a bit of a bummer that I could just at least take apart. And the most sensible way for a hatching shader would be, or actually the only way I can think of, is write one that ends up being an option in here. The halftone option is that was still available this month to vote for, and that's why I also explicitly wrote, okay, it's going to be a halftone texture, but not a shader. Um, so it's not going to take the shaded surfaces, but it's going to take whatever color values you feed into it, which could be an image or something. Which is also why it's a lot less useful, to be honest. One kind of way to go around that, the way that Lightwave handles things nowadays, is oh, where is it? Where is it? There's so many plugins here, but I don't even know which name I'm looking for. Shading, of course, yeah. There is a single light Lambert node. And this one essentially allows you to pick one light. Then it applies Lambert shading model, which is essentially a diffuse shading model to it. And outputs shaded RGB. That could be used as a base for the for something like a hatched shader, and then you would still have to drive a material output, but you would essentially have a material that's 100% luminous, has no other components, and then wouldn't work with GI. So that's a bit of a bummer. But that would be one way to do it within within the nodal network by actually doing the shading in a custom plugin as well. And the code for that exists already. But then getting that out of the nodal network into the final render by using basically what you would have to do is where are they? Materials. There we go. Yeah, it's not even a. Let's use principled. Basically, what you would need to do is luminous color, set everything to 0, luminosity to 100%, take the color from the shaded output, and then use that to drive the material input. It's one way around it. The big advantage of how Lightwave handles the materials now is previously, if you had like multiple nodes, each of them doing their own shading, they would also send out or request their own their own rays to be traced. So if two or more materials would actually need reflections, each one of them would trace the different rays for reflections, or trace them again because they wouldn't know of each other. The big difference in 2018 and onwards is that with the shading model, is that the shading model requests the rays for the combination of all existing materials, which makes it faster. Because the rays are only being traced once in the shading model, but not individually in different material shading nodes. And the single light Lambert kind of goes against that because it goes back to actually tracing rays in the node again. But it does work. So yeah, that's essentially the issue with it with the hatching, is that the shading happens in a different part, and we already see that if you look at the shading models here, we have the cell shader. Both of them actually, the normal one and the sublimation cell shader, they are already implemented as shading models, which makes complete sense. And hatching shader to do it properly would need to be a shading model as well, with various options here. So yeah, short question, long answer. Sorry for that. Hope it didn't bore you. Um, yeah, and since there is no sample code for it or anybody to ask, I would rather not tackle it because this is one area that's fairly new that, as far as I know, no third party has explored. And that always makes it very, very tricky to confidently say, okay, I'm going to write something that is going to be a new shading model and it's going to work. So yeah, even though I'd love to have it, I really would. I think it's a really nice way to shade as well, especially if you have one of those smarter hatches. And you know, I've worked in movies that used a fairly similar style of rendering, except that it was completely hand drawn, and I would love to be able to make something like that in Lightwave. So yeah, that is pretty much all I've got to talk about. Unless you have any more questions that would put me on a tangent for another 20 minutes, which I wouldn't mind at all. um, but yeah, um, so yeah, the idea is to look at the bug for 2019, see if I can send out a fix tomorrow or so. Um, I might even have a second look at the morph deformer, the more spline morph deformer, just to see what the last two issues are and maybe add the offsets because I think they would be cool. And 42, of course. No, wait, that was the answer. That was the answer to the question of life. But yeah, as long as you have a towel, you have enough purpose. So yeah, and next week is when I'm gonna actually put some actual code behind the mock-up that you've seen for the second unit. And since nobody had any preference on which name to actually use for the plugin, I've stuck with second unit. Um, but please, if you have any suggestions on what could be stored and saved, send them out, and I'll see if they can be added or not. But those three are definitely going to be in there. So yeah, thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening. I hope that it wasn't too much rambling and there was plenty of information in here. We will get back to our regular schedule, which means that at the end of the month there's going to be a Q&A. We will make sure that you get the second unit before that. You should get the other patches before that anyways, but the second unit should be done by end of next week or something like that. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end of the month, where you can join us on Discord. And yeah, until then, thanks for joining. Thanks for listening to all the patrons. Thanks for supporting us. For all of you that aren't patrons, why? And yeah, stay safe out there. Good night. Bye bye.